All right, so we have learned a little bit about poetry, including what it is and why we read it. Now we need to look at step 3 of the process, which is how to read poetry. And this part gets pretty complicated. So we'll try to break it up as best as we can so we can do it a little piece at a time. So when we read poetry, there's a bunch of things we need to take into consideration, including rhyme, meter, scansion, phonics, pacing, grammar, and style. And just to further complicate things, some of these have elements that can fit into multiple categories. So we'll talk about some things and we'll try to make it as clear as we can, but some of this stuff, because it crosses over, can get a little bit confusing. So if you strap in, we'll get through this a little bit at a time. So we're going to start here with rhyme. Now, most people know what rhymes are because we've been exposed to things like nursery rhymes ever since we were kids. And so you hear rhymes and you think, okay, that's it. There's just one type of rhyme. I know what it is, and we'll go from there. But unfortunately, that's not quite all there is to it. Rhyme is actually pretty complicated. So let's go over this again a little bit at a time and talk about what it is that you need to know, and more importantly, how does it affect you and the poem that you're going to be reading. So rhymes can be used to find the rhythm within a line as well as patterns between lines through a repetition of sound. That's essentially what rhyming is just repeating the same sounds in a word over and over again. And then our brains light up because we recognize a match in the sound, and so it makes us happy when we hear that. So one of the first terms that we need to know, and this one's going to come up a lot, is assonance. This is to repeat vowels such as roof and tooth. And some of the examples that we're going to look at today include a lot about assonance. So we're going to keep this in mind because it is going to come up. We also have consonance, which is to repeat consonants such as cut and mat. Now, obviously, these are kind of difficult terms to remember, especially because consonants and consonants sound very similar. So while it's easy to keep them in mind because they both are very similar, it's also really easy to get them mixed up and to forget which one is which. So don't stress out too much about it. We just want to remember that there are these different examples of ways that you can rhyme just using sound. We have things like perfect rhyme, which shares both assonance and stressed syllables such as might and light. And we'll talk more about stressed and unstressed syllables when we get into the meter. So you don't need to worry about that too much. But you do the thing that we do want to focus on is is that we have those syllables at the end, might and light. The ite is the same, which makes it a perfect rhyme. You have slant rhymes. This is where we have assonance, but we don't have the same stresses. So for an example, in deference to Mr. Marshall Mathers, Eminem, orange and door hinge are slant rhymes, but they're not perfect rhymes because they don't have the same stresses. While the suggestion is that colors, especially orange, purple, and silver, don't have words in the English language that rhyme with them, the more correct response is that they don't have perfect rhymes that rhyme with them. And purple and silver are obviously a little bit more difficult to get to. But orange, Eminem famously said he rhymed orange and door hinge. He also rhymed orange and syringe. So those are slant rhymes because they don't match the same stresses. And again, we'll talk about stresses later. But that's why they can sound a little bit off, but on paper they look like they rhyme perfectly. There's sight rhymes or eye rhymes. So these are words that look like they might rhyme, but they don't, at least in modern English, such as tough and through. So we have in writing we have that same end syllable, but we know as native English speakers that those words don't quite match up when you say them out loud. And we want to keep this one in particular in mind, because with the example poem that we're going to look at the end of this, one of the terms, and we'll point it out when we get there, is a sight rhyme currently, but when it was originally penned, the English language and pronunciations back then were different, so it was closer to a perfect rhyme that's just changed over time. We have internal rhyme. So this is a rhyme in the middle of a line rather than just at the end. For example, once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered weak and weary. That's a line from Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. And in that same line, we have the two rhymes there, which kind of give it that really flowing speed. And if you listen to artists like Busta Rhymes, he uses internal rhymes a lot, especially with assonance, to really make that da 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 feeling with his beats, with his lines there. So internal rhyme is also a really big part of rhyming. It's not just how does a sentence or how does a line end, but what are the components inside of it. There's masculine rhymes. So this is a rhyme in which only one syllable, usually the end, matches. A lot of single syllable words work as masculine rhymes, but sometimes you have a word where it doesn't quite match up quite as well. And when we look at the next one, feminine rhymes, that might make a little bit more sense. So we also have feminine rhymes. This is rhymes in which multiple syllables match. For example, crazy and lazy. So that last syllable, that azy, is a perfect rhyme. Or as a matching rhyme, because they are obviously the exact same sound and they've just changed that first syllable, the cr or the l. But as you can hear from the sound, those also rhyme, so both halves of the word match. In masculine rhymes, it wouldn't do that. You have end rhymes, rhymes in which the last syllable matches. Again, so if we look at that feminine rhyme, we see those end rhymes. It's an example of both there. There's also examples in which you can do a feminine rhyme that's a three-syllable word where the first syllable and the last syllable rhyme, but the middle one doesn't. And when we look at things like complexity of poetry or complexity of rhymes in hip-hop, the ability to use feminine rhymes is really one of those hallmarks that we look for to see how well something was written. If somebody only relies on masculine rhymes because they only know how to rhyme one-syllable words, it really changes the way that we might view them. So if you're big fans of people like Black Alicious or Tyler the Creator, you see some of the more complex rhymes. Eminem is obviously another one where we see that a lot. But in people who either are just starting out with writing poetry or writing hip-hop lyrics, a lot of times they'll fall back onto those masculine rhymes only because they get in a flow and then they don't know how to go back and revise, or that maybe they just need more practice or something like that. So it's not a value judgment so much as just one of those things for how complex somebody is. We have para rhymes. So this is rhymes in which consonants, but not syllables, match. So like loving, living is an example. Will Smith did that in one of his songs. Where you hit that loving, living to try to get the repetition of sounds, but it doesn't quite match up enough to call itself a rhyme. And then finally, you have forced rhymes. This is the one that a lot of beginning poets will try to do, and it's generally a really, really bad thing because it either sounds awful or they're trying to match the style of someone who writes very differently than we might do today. So this is where you either twist words or you twist the syntax of words in order to make things rhyme. For instance, I believe it's Lil Wayne that rhymes mansion and Wisconsin. Obviously, the word's Wisconsin, but if you twist it enough, you can make those two things rhyme. So that's an example of a forced rhyme. Or to like break the sentence up and switch around the syntax. So like you're writing in Yoda speak, for instance, to get a rhyme. That's a forced rhyme. And a lot of people will try to do this to match the Elizabethan English syntax and make it sound very Shakespearean. But more often what it comes across as is that you're just not particularly good at rhyming, so you have to really twist your sentence around rather than just coming up with a better rhyme. So when we're writing poetry, try to avoid forced rhymes. They don't work as well as you might think that they do. We have semi-rhymes. So these are rhymes that would normally match, but they have an affix that changes them, such as time and climbs. There's a whole joke, if you're familiar with the show Parks and Rec, where John Ralphio does this while he's trying to rap. So those are things that if you do it quickly in a song, it's really easy to pass over, and it doesn't really attract much notice. But if you really slow down or do a lyrical analysis, it's a lot easier to pick up how they don't quite work. There's identical rhymes. These are using polysemic words. That's words that have that are spelled the same but have different meanings. Or homophones as rhymes. So ball and ball, or ran and ran. Obviously, there's different definitions for ran depending on the context you're using it in. So even though it's spelled the same, you change the meaning. So those would be that's what we would refer to as an identical rhyme. And those are generally, as opposed to people who are masters of identical rhymes, especially people going back to like Black Alicious, who were big fans of using puns and twisting words around. Sage Francis is another one. We'll look at some of his words here in a little bit, are very good at using identical rhymes to give their sentences and their phrases multiple meanings. Shakespeare did this a lot too, especially in plays like Hamlet. We also have monorhymes. So this is to end each line with the same word. We'll look at an example, which is the NYC song by John Cafferty and the Beaver Brown Band here in just a second. So when this is done poorly, it looks just like really lazy writing. But when it's done very well, it gives a lot of thought and evokes a lot of different feelings with a particular piece of music or piece of poetry. So let's look at a well-done example of this, which are these 4 lines in the song. I've been wishing on these stars too long. I've been playing in these bars too long. I've been holed up in your arms too long. I've been a prisoner of my heart too long. So if we look at these, even though each line ends with exactly the same phrase, it really does a good job of reinforcing the feelings that he's trying to do of wanting to go to New York City and be famous. And, he's tired of playing in the small town bars and just kind of scraping by. So it does a really, really good job. The more you look at these, the more you can kind of pull out meaning and information. And, even just in these 4 lines, without even hearing the rest of the song, you can kind of understand the narrator and his conflict and things like that. So really, really well-crafted example here of a monorhyme, as opposed to some really, really bad ones. With respect to Avril Lavigne, some of her early songs showed really bad examples of monorhyme. So then we also have a rhyme scheme. So the rhyme scheme is listing matching rhymes in any given piece, usually expressed through an alphabetical code. So if you look here, and we'll go through this line by line to see, but if you look here on the right side of the screen, you'll see that there's letters A, A, B, A, A, C, D, D, D. And each of those letters is used to match the lines with other lines that end with that same rhyme. So if we look at this, dim and in, so that's the assonance rhyme. Their im and in don't quite rhyme, but the I is repeated so that they phonetically sound like they rhyme enough to qualify. So if we go through this, and especially this is a really, really good example of the way that line length and the way that lines can flow to create a certain feeling, how that works. Obviously, I'm not a rap god myself, so I'll do my best with this one, but it's not going to come close to touching the real thing. All of a sudden, it gets dim. The crater face steps in, puts Mexican drum breaks on the Technics. He's like, let's begin. He conducted an orchestra so dope the sun started sweating him. I guess he expected to win on pure artistic merit. Composing complex plays with nothing but sound bites, burned out the lights, made MCs too self-conscious, quit the master mics for 1,000 nights. And then the song goes on from there. But if you look at just those ending words, dim, in, begin, him, we have that rhyme scheme, and if we really wanted to split hairs, we could even break it up more and call it ABC, ABC, or ABD on that one. And we can rhyme dim and hymn and in and begin as separate rhymes. For the purposes of this, I didn't want to get that complicated, mostly focus on the assonance and match all those as A's. Why does this matter? Is because what you are going to do is with your own poems, you are going to try to figure out what the rhyme scheme is. So all you have to do is look through your poems and see which lines have those matching sounds at the very end. And some poems, if they're written in blank verse, they don't have that matching rhyme at all. And in that case, you're going to look through it and you would mark it as blank verse. So if that's what happened, you don't have to go through and mark each one with a separate letter. Now, if you have a particularly long poem with a lot of really complex ending rhymes, you can also double up on the letters. So if you've gone through the whole alphabet, you can get to things like AA, BB, CC, and you can do it like that. Such as I used to have students do the rhyme scheme for Billy Collins Canada, and that one has a lot of rhymes and it's fairly long, so you end up doubling up on those letters. So if that happens, don't be afraid to do that. That's how poetry works. Okay, so we're going to take a pause here. I want to take a look at our first example of poetry that we're going to examine, which is also our first look into Shakespeare. So we're going to take a look at one of his sonnets, and we're going to see if we can come up with the rhyme scheme for this one together. I particularly like this one, not only because it's Shakespeare and because it's so well written, but because the rhyme scheme is really, really subtle, especially if you read it in modern English instead of more Elizabethan English and the pronunciations. Those are going to be a little bit different. But also, it was so well done that if you don't know to look for the rhyme scheme, you wouldn't hear it at all. So let's go through this and listen to it, see if you can find the rhyme scheme. But while we're doing that, also, see if you can figure out what is the poem actually about. So Sonnet 18, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, by William Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wander'st in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So there is our example of a poem that from William Shakespeare, a sonnet, and it is written with the exact same rhyme scheme as all of his sonnets, which is why Elizabethan sonnets are also referred to as Shakespearean sonnets, because they're so famous for this. So take a look, see if you can figure out the rhyme scheme without just Googling it, I suppose, and then see if you can decode what the poem is actually about. All right, we'll leave you here, and we'll pick this back up with meter next time.